few years now, I've been really delving into Doctor Who's expanded universe. The audios and the books, etc, etc. I've managed to come across a good handful of Doctor Who books that I really like, and I think are like top tier Doctor Who stories in general. And I think one of the biggest and most, I guess, famous Doctor Who book ranges of them all would be the Virgin New Adventures range from the 90s. Very quick summary: when Doctor Who was cancelled in 1989, a couple of years later the Virgin Book Company, they got the license to begin publishing Doctor Who books, and that continued for a good few years, and it was essentially the continuation of Doctor Who, at the time anyway. They've been kind of swept under the rug in the years since, but they're still a pretty interesting little corner of Doctor Who canon from what I've gathered so far. Despite being the continuation of 1980s Doctor Who, yeah, the VNAs tended to get a lot more mature and adult oriented. Basically, I guess the way you could sum up the Virgin New Adventures book range would be, it's basically still Doctor Who, but it's on like the maturity level of Torchwood for the most part. And just like Torchwood, it has its bad uses of the adult license and its good uses. Yeah, they can be kind of a mixed bag from what I've heard so far, but basically, what I'm trying to say is this video is going to be me giving my thoughts on the Virgin New Adventures range so far. For the last year or so, I've started reading them, and so far I've read the first two, so Time Worms, Genesis and Exodus, and I'm currently halfway through Time Worm Apocalypse. So yeah, that's where I am with this series at the moment. And of course I got Time Worm Revelation, and I've got the Three Cats Cradle books, and then I've also got the two standalones, Nightshade and Love and War, and that's as many as I currently own. Since it seems I'm going to be going down this rabbit hole of reading all the old Wilderness Years books of the Doctor Who universe for the foreseeable future, yeah, I thought I'd decide to give my thoughts on what I think of this range of books in particular from where I'm currently at with them. Okay, I understand that was kind of a messy, rambly intro, but I hope you're still following this, and if you are, then good for you. So yeah, basically, what do I think of this series so far? Well, it's certainly been interesting, to say the least. Yeah, the earlier VNA books do have a bit of an infamous reputation for generally not being that great, especially the Time Worm series overall. Apparently Time Worm Revelation is the first book in the series to actually be like really good, but I'm not quite there yet. As soon as I finish Apocalypse, I'll be moving on to Revelation, because, you know, that's the order that they take place in, and I would be mad to read them out of order considering they're a connected story arc. Well, having said they're a connected story arc, I gotta say, as a story arc, so far, from the perspective of someone who's halfway through the third book in the series, this is one of the weakest story arcs I've ever come across in fiction. Like, so far, the first three books have been, well, the second one at least was pretty good as a standalone story. The first one was, gonna be honest, not too keen on it. I'll get more into that later. And the first half of the third book, which is where I'm at the moment, or I'm a little over halfway, I'm about 2/3 of the way through this one. But yeah, so far this one's fairly intriguing. A little bit by the books in places. That was not an intended pun, by the way. I don't even know if that counts as a pun, but what the hell. But yeah, I mean, it's nothing terrible, but it's nothing hugely outstanding. It says it takes place at the end of the universe, but there's not really anything done with that premise so far. And yeah, yeah, but from what I've heard from other people talking about the books, the Time Worm arc is really non-existent for the most part. It's like, it pretty much gets set up throughout the course of the first book, and then it's largely forgotten about through the rest of the series as far as I can gather, and then it gets like picked up and finished off in the fourth and final book. Yeah, the Time Worm is a villain I'm really not keen on. I mean, a woman who tried to beat death by becoming immortal, by becoming like a mechanized hybrid creature that comes from another planet and then starts interfering with ancient civilization on Earth. That's pretty cool. Good premise. But it's just the way that she's written. Yeah, in the first one especially, she's basically just a cackling villain, and there's no real depth to her at all. I don't like, yeah. The Time Worm's not really that much of an intriguing villain for me, which is why I prefer the standalone stories from these books more than the overarching plot so far. The second book, Exodus, is really good. By the first 50 pages alone, I was just like, wow, really intrigued with it. Yeah, really good story about alternate history with the whole Nazi takeover thing, and then bringing back the warlords and the war chief from the war games. Yeah, I was really interested in it. Although it did go a little bit off the rails towards the end, I'd say. It's still pretty good, the second one. And the third one so far, yeah, it's alright. It's the sort of advanced alien race, subjugates and manipulates the history of another alien race. And yeah, so far I'm liking it. I'm not sure where it's going. But the third book in a 4-part series where the Time Worm is the main villain, well, she's obviously the main villain in the first book. In the second book, she's trapped inside Hitler's brain for the entire story, and she barely does anything. And so far, she hasn't even shown up in the third book, so I don't know what the fuck's going on there. And I'm not sure what happens in the fourth book, but I guess we'll get to that when we get to that. Yeah, I've heard that this series does get better as it goes on, like after the Cat's Cradle trilogy that comes after the Time Worm series. Once we get past that mark, it starts to get like pretty decent, from what I've heard anyway, that is. But yeah, some stuff in general. Some thoughts about the more mature side that they're going for with this series. There's swearing, there's some drug references, there's sex stuff. A lot of unnecessary sex stuff in the first book. Okay, I'm going to call this section of the video Jake rants about the unnecessary and creepy sexual elements of Time Worm Genesis. So, I'm not inherently against giving Doctor Who a more adult feel. It's basically just the tone of Torchwood slapped onto a 7th Doctor story, which I'm not complaining about, you know. But with Time Worm Genesis, it's like, I mean, John Peel, were you trying to write a Doctor Who story or a fucking erotic novel? Like, what? I mean, yes, the book is set in Mesopotamia, which is one of the earliest known civilizations of the human race, so it's like thousands of years ago. So yes, you can write attitudes of characters in such a way that reflects the reality of that time period, but there's no need to go overboard with it, like, geez. And also, I've heard that John Peel hated the 7th Doctor, which is weird because why would he write this book? Why would Virgin hire an author to write the first book in what would become a long-running series of novels featuring the 7th Doctor? Why would they hire a writer who hated the 7th Doctor to write the first book in this series? Why? What? Why? Why would you do that? So yeah, the biggest problems with Time Worm Genesis, I'd say, are, I mean, first things first, the plots. While it's got some interesting ideas behind it, it really isn't that interesting. It's a pretty dull story overall, really. Doesn't really do a good job of getting me interested in the historical setting that it's trying to explore. The author supposedly hated the main character, so the 7th Doctor in this is, I'm not gonna lie, he's kind of an asshole. More than usual. I know the 7th Doctor could be kind of a manipulative, scheming little bastard, but like at least there was a fun, lovable side to him as well, and like not even the 6th Doctor was this much of a cockface than what 7 is at certain points in this book. There's a pretty infamous scene in here somewhere where Ace is essentially sexually violated or assaulted, or almost is, and she complains about it to the Doctor, and now I get where they're coming from with this, because the Doctor says that's the attitude of the time period that we're in, you know, experience the new culture and accept it. I agree with the whole accepting different ways of different cultures thing, because, you know, it's Doctor Who, it's about travelling around the universe and experiencing new ways of living from different civilizations. But when it's this particular circumstance, it's kind of wrong. You can accept the cultures of other civilizations, but you shouldn't really just so easily accept and easily tell other people to just accept weirdness of the sexual attitudes. Do you get where I'm coming from with this? It's kind of problematic, in case you couldn't tell. There's another scene, like, right towards the beginning where the character Gilgamesh, who's like this like ancient historical legend, who's a character in this book, he's at dinner, essentially groping a 13-year-old girl. I don't think Torchwood even went that far. I mean, they had paedophile characters and everything that were pieces of shit, but They never had a fucking character who you're supposed to like, who's supposed to be one of the hero characters. They never had anyone like that, literally touching up a minor. So yeah, that's kind of some of the biggest issues with this, for want of a better word, garbage. I mean, the plot itself, when it did get interesting occasionally, I was invested. The story is okay, but there's a lot of shit in this book that I don't like. Thankfully, a lot of the inappropriate stuff is toned down for the second book, which I thoroughly enjoyed, Time Worm Exodus. Basically an alternate history where the warlords and the war chief from the war games, they basically make a return and they decide to interfere with the course of World War II, and Nazi Germany win the Second World War. The first half of the book is spent with the Doctor and Ace trying not to get killed, basically, in Nazi-occupied Britain in the 1950s, and then the second half is them sort of travelling through a few different time periods to try and get history back on the right track, and also find the time worm who's stuck inside Hitler's brain for the whole story. That happened. It's kind of weird that Hitler's being manipulated by both the time worm, who doesn't seem to really do anything apart from make him hateful, I guess, and he's also being manipulated by the warlords to, I don't know, get even more powerful than he already is at this point. Yeah, it kind of goes off the rails in a few places, but overall it's really enjoyable. It's a really interesting moral dilemma where the Doctor, obviously you'd never want to do this thing, but the Doctor basically has to visit Hitler throughout different points in his timeline leading up to his election as leader of the Nazi party and all that. Basically befriend him and sort of help him through his career, essentially. Obviously that's something that you'd never want to do in real life, but for the sake of the preservation of history, the Doctor is basically forced to do this, and it's quite an interesting interesting little moral dilemma, I guess. Overall, really enjoyable story, that, and so far, Time Worm Apocalypse I'm quite liking. It's a bit more basic, nowhere near as horny or anything like that as the first book. Still got some pretty grim moments in it though, just like the first two. So far I think I can conclude that if you're going to do Doctor Who in a more adult fashion, what you should do is do some more grim stuff, some more adult themes that are more mature rather than immature, basically. I think that makes sense. What you shouldn't do is basically make an erotic novel that would basically get you arrested in any civilized country. I might be misremembering, but I am sure Time Worm Genesis has something about quivering breasts, and it really takes you out of the fucking story. I can't stand that. Probably won't be something that I'll be going back for a reread anytime soon, that's for sure. But yeah, despite the flaws so far, I am pretty well enjoying this series at the moment. Looking forward to finishing up Apocalypse and moving on to Time Worm Revelation, which I've heard is pretty much where this series really starts to kick off and get good. Yeah, looking forward to some other stories as well, like Cat's Cradle Warhead. Really looking forward to Love and War. Really excited to sort of get through this series, basically, and perhaps I'll do an update in a couple of years, maybe when I've sort of read a bit further into the series. But yeah, for now, that's kind of my scattered thoughts on the Virgin New Adventures range. Basically me just praising a few aspects that I liked, and me just absolutely bashing on some of the rightfully hated on elements from the earlier books. Yeah, I'll be back hopefully within a couple of weeks with another video on this channel, and yeah, bye for now everybody!